Hello everybody, welcome back, and in today's episode Tom is going to be doing a deep dive into his production methods for our track Mind Over Man.
So I thought I would go through one of our tracks, Mind Over Man, just to sort of show what I do production-wise, the process that I like to use and things like that. So layout-wise, on a project, I'll usually follow the same sort of layout. Drums first, or bust, bass, guitars, again, bust, and then anything else, synths, strings, any other sort of wibbly-wobbly things will go after that. And that's the way that I would probably always set out my projects, just because it's tidier. I know where things are, it's just easier. So I'll just play a little bit of the track to give you an idea, and then we'll just go through the drums, or bit by bit, what I do processing wise, and you can get an idea. So there we go. I really like this section of this song. It's really, really nice. It gave me an opportunity to try something quite nice and just have the drums sort of hang back a little bit, keeping things interesting. But but because it's quite a clean, quiet section, I didn't want the drums to be sort of just in your face constantly, because there's a chance for that as the song builds. So it's a great builder, this song. For the drums, for the guitars, for everything really. So once it reaches that halfway mark and becomes really, really heavy, it's already built up. So you've got that massive build, and it just sounds great. So in terms of the MIDI sort of programming that I'm using, again, if we could afford to hit a studio up and record it, I would love nothing more than to do that. But unfortunately, at the moment, financially, it just doesn't seem the right thing to do right now. But there we go. So, editing-wise, like I said, because this is quite a clean section, I wanted it to really sort of lay back, just give everything a little bit of room to breathe. So the drums, I'm being very, very deliberate here in the programming of them, just to make it just hang back, but still keep it interesting, keep the listener interested in what's going on. So as you can see, things like the ghost notes on here, they're very, very, very low down, but they're still loud enough for where you can make them out, you can hear them clearly, and it's like I say, it's clean, and it just sounds tidy and tight next to everything else, next to Liam's guitar playing and the bass, which we are also syncopating up the bass and the drums. So that was sort of another reason why I wanted to just keep it nice and keep it fairly simple, just to really, really, really accent what the bass is playing. And I think that works quite nicely. So the kit I'm using for this as well is the P4 by GGD. It's a great kit. I love using this kit. In terms of what I'm doing in this, I'm sort of pushing the snare more than I probably would usually into the room and the overheads, because it gave it a really, really nice fat sound to it, and I really liked that. I'm pulling it back quite a bit on the toms. I'm also gating the floor toms a little bit, just because there was a lot of low end resonance in those toms, and I didn't want that to sort of interfere with the mix anywhere. Cymbals, pretty standard, and that's about it on that. So we'll start off with the kick. I'll show you what I'm doing on that. I deliberately tried to not do too much in terms of reductive, additive EQ, compression, just adding things onto it, because it's already such a great sounding kit. I wanted to keep that sound. I didn't want to completely just change it by adding loads and loads of things to it. So as you can see on here, I'm just doing a little bit of sort of A little bit of reductive EQ around the mid-range here, just because it was a bit boxy. That's really all I'm doing to that. Really, a little bit of a reduction on there, just because that's where the actual kick sound was sounding, and it was just a little bit too much for me. So I took that out just a tiny bit, just to tidy it up a bit. That's all I'm really doing. Really, it's just making small adjustments to tidy things up. And that's it. So I'll play it with, play it without. And you can get an idea of what it's actually doing. So you can hear there, that boxiness immediately gone, tidies it up, metals it up a little bit as well, which I like. So moving on, I'm using the smash and grab compressor, set to grab, set to kick. And again, I'm using this very sparingly, just to bring the kick forward in the mix a little bit. The mix set about halfway, threshold about minus 33 dB, and that's all I'm doing. I'm pushing the input a tiny bit just to put a little bit more into it, but that's really all I'm doing. So I'll play it before, play it with, and you can see. So you can hear it just brings it forward a little bit, makes it just that tiny little bit louder, but also just smartens it up a little bit, which is really good, especially when the double kick kicks in the second half of the song. Becomes really, really prominent then. So moving on to snare. Again, I'm keeping it fairly simple in terms of what I'm doing on here. A little bit of boxiness around 700 mark taken out. A little bit of a boost at around 1200 hertz there. And there's quite a prominent cut-off here that I'm doing. And the reason for that is just because there was a very, very, very harsh resonant sound from the drum, so I just notched that out just to smarten it up again, because that was really muddying things up. It happens a lot when recording drums. It's just the resonant sound of that drum. Sometimes it can work nicely in a mix, but in this case, I wanted it out. So I'll put the notch in, and you can kind of hear what I mean. You can hear that notch there. Obviously, I'm bringing it up so you can get a better idea, but it is there quite prominently. So I wanted that out just to tidy up. So moving on from that, again, the smash and grab. Again, I'm not doing a huge amount in terms of pushing the threshold or anything like that. I am, however, using quite a harsh amount of the saturation effect. The reason I did this was because it almost gave it a sort of a pop snare sound sort of effect, and I really liked how that worked. And also it tamed the peak of the snare, which I would usually do anyway, but I wouldn't add this much. Usually this is quite unusual for me to do that, but I liked the way it sounded and I think it worked. So I'll play that with and without. So you can hear there the peak of the snare really being tailed off, which I really liked. But it's not too much that it ends up destroying the drum. I mean, maxing things out is never a good idea, especially with compression, especially on drums, because you can really start to clip them and just completely destroy it. see there, way too much, not needed. But where I have it, I think works for this song and sounds good. So onto the toms. Again, not making too many adjustments apart from this rather worrying looking boost in the high end from around 5k. Now the reason for this was I was watching a video from Nolly where he did the It's Only Smiles Masterclass and he was using the FabFilter Saturn saturation plugin, but he was using the bands in a way that really boosted the high end, and I thought it sounded really, really, really cool. I don't own it, so I thought, well, I'll just do something really daft and just play around with the high end on this and see what happens. And I think I got a pretty good sound from it. Liam seemed really happy with it, so that's all that matters really. Let's see if I can find some toms. That's probably a good idea. In fact, I might play from a little bit further on, just around here. There we go. So individually, I have them all individually and then bussed to a tom bus. So I'm making small amounts of additive and reductive EQ just to again take any boxiness out. For the higher toms, I sort of tamed the low end a tiny bit because they're tuned higher. I don't want as much low end sort of muddying them up a little bit, and then on the floor tom, just sort of letting that low end stay quite a bit, adding another probably unnecessary additiveness around 8k on each one of these, again just because I think it really worked really well to improve the sound. So I'll just play that little bit of drums and I'll take all of the EQ off, and you can kind of get an idea of what that's actually doing, all of this additiveness. So here it is without. So you can kind of hear there, quite boxy sounding. Not bad, but you know, not attacky enough in my liking, especially for what I wanted to try and achieve with this. But then if we add these EQs back in, suddenly that initial stick hit onto the toms becomes really, really sharp. You're not losing any of the tonality of the drum either, which is what I was really worried about doing things like this. But I think it works really, really well. Other than that, only other thing I'm doing to this is again smash and grab, set to tom. Sort of similar sort of layout again, really. Other than that, about a -33 on the thresholds, mix wise, pushing it a little bit harder, and then just a tiny bit, about 3.5 extra dB on the input of it, and that's about it. So I'll just play with and without again, you can get an idea. So I think that really helps just in terms of the presence of that drum. Doesn't lose any of the tonality either. In fact, I think it sort of brings that out quite a bit more by adding this particular compressor. Works fantastically well. And then on to the overheads. So I'm making quite a drastic cut of low end onto this because I wanted to take out any muddiness which you can sometimes get in overheads and room mics quite badly. Sometimes you might want that in a sound, but for this being a heavier metally sound, I wanted to keep the cymbals in, keep the nice sheen and brightness of those, but I wanted to take out any boxy low end boom from things like the kick, from the snare, from the toms. One thing I do like to do, and I will always do this, almost always on overheads, is around the 5k mark. I will always take quite a harsh reduction. See there, I'm pushing down around 4.6 dB around 5k. The reason for that is because you get a lot of raspy sort of abrasiveness from the cymbals around there. And as you move on in mixing, if things are getting louder, that can sometimes really, really be quite harsh on the ears. I can show you an example and give you an idea. I'll find a little bit of a heavier section. That'll probably work a little bit better. See there, you can kind of hear, especially from the hi-hats there, when the hi-hats are being thrashed as they are in this particular section, that was really becoming quite horrible to listen to almost. So taking it out, suddenly everything becomes a little bit clearer. And then only other thing again on that, smash and grab, set to overheads. Again, sort of not being too harsh on the threshold, just enough to sort of, again, tame the peak of the snare drum in particular, because you don't want too much snare head bleed sort of interfering with any peaks or any transients in the mix, because that can become quite an annoying thing as you go through, especially when you start to send it off to be mastered, things like that. You're suddenly having to really, really duck down on the drums, and that can really, really destroy the sound sometimes. So play it with, play it without. You can see there that initial snare hit is really, really being ducked down, but it's not too much where it's starting to really, really duck the sound too much of the snare of those overheads. Last but not least, we have our room. Again, I wanted to take out a fair amount of that low end resonance from things like the kick and the snare, especially in this overhead room. It's a really, really nice sounding room, but I didn't want anything, like I said, interfering with this particular track too much in terms of the drums. I wanted to keep the kick to where the kick was in its close mic, and just give it body more than anything. Give it space. Same with the snare. Give it the space, but not the actual low end in the room in the overheads, if that makes sense. Probably not. But I'll play. See, I'm just doing very small amounts here. Adding a bit more of the high end just to add some brightness back into it. Again, making a cut around the 5k mark just to tidy up that harsh raspiness. So I'll play with without. So you can hear quite a drastic difference. Like I said, with that low end gone, it tidies it up quite a bit, and the brightness added just keeps that really bright shininess of the cymbals. Makes a drastic difference. It really does. And then last but not least, again, good old smash and grab, set to smash. I'm pushing the input of this one a little bit, and the mix a tiny bit, and also the air control, which sort of, again, adds more brightness into it, which I thought would be a really good idea considering it's the room. I want it to be sort of quite nice, big, spacey. So I added a tiny little bit more of that high-end resonance there, pushing the saturation a tiny bit again, just to tame any transients that are peaking anywhere, so basically the snare. And I think it works quite nicely. So there you go. Brings it together, really, really brightens that room up quite nicely. I was really happy with that. And last but not least, the parallel compression bus. So what I'm doing here is bussing all of these individual tracks, so the toms, the snare, the kick, the overheads, smashing them into this. This is a technique again I got from Nolly. Basically, the aim being to utterly destroy the sound going into this, because this is essentially just an extra drum bus is what I've created with it. If I take this off, that's all that's happening with this. It's just an extra drum bus. There's nothing actually happening to it. But with this, the smash and grab set to parallel, pushing the mix, pushing the saturation, pushing the threshold quite considerably. Also pushing about 8.1 dB on the input, just to put as much of the sound in as possible. With it on, it sounds like this. So that's a prime example of, as I said earlier, of what you probably shouldn't do in terms of over compressing. But that's what I wanted to achieve with this, with the aim being just to give it an extra massive reinforcement of just thwap, basically. Because as you can hear, like the snare and the kick in particular, anything that's hit hard, any shells of the drums, they're really, really sort of being absolutely ducked by the threshold of the compressor. But that's what I want, because in the overall sound it sort of acts as a reinforcer for that sound. So if I play it all together, you kind of get a better idea of what I mean. I'll take the parallel compression in and out just so you can sort of get an idea. See, it's subtle. It is very subtle, but you can just about make out what I mean with the with that extra added thwap to it. It just almost adds a level of volume to it, but the velocities of everything as well, because it's being smashed completely by that compressor, it becomes really, really, really just punchy, the whole drum sound, to that next extreme. I was really happy with that. That's about it, really, in terms of the drums on that. Next I'll probably move on to anything string based, so I'll move on to the bass. Won't take too long. And then the guitars, we have a couple more of them. We have quite a bit going on with that, so that'll be on for next time, I think.